Were these suspensions handled correctly?
I don't think that they were handled correctly at all. I look at the Juju Schuster hit, and that's something that, while I played, that was one of the major hits coming back on a reverse or possibly for a big block. I mean, I know that the crown of his helmet hit the chin of Burfett, but that's something that happens in football. It's a bang-bang deal, and I look at it as not of a dirty play, but the actual act afterwards was one that I think a lot of football, people as far as in the league are concerned, are looking at it as a dirty play. He shouldn't have stood over him. That's just something you don't do. If you make the block, hey, we'll keep moving and try to make another block. Then you continue to go on to the George Ioka play. That's another bang-bang deal in the end zone. I mean, when a guy is exploding up top for a catch, I mean, where do you want him to hit him? He's right there in his chest. Antonio Brown ended up kind of crunching down, leaning his head down, and it ended up being another bang-bang deal where it hit him in the helmet. So I didn't think that they were dirty plays to the point where you needed to suspend them for one game. And then you compare that to what we've seen from Rob Gronkowski. Rob Gronkowski, from the very beginning, should have had 3 to 4 game suspension, where that allows him now to go ahead and try to appeal that. When you look at all across of the suspensions this year, I mean, the Trevathan to the Crabtree and Aqib Talib, which was suspended 2 games and 1 or 2 games, and did they appeal? I just think it's unfair for the way that, Roger Goodell and the rest of his staff has continued to look at these things and just sort of throw out a 1-game suspension when they should be a little bit more strenuous on how they're coming down. Those 2 that we see, now it was a rough game, not that Sunday night, but it was a rough game. I just think for Pittsburgh Steelers as well as the Cincinnati Bengals, we really need to think about those suspensions.
I want to start with something that Stephen A. said the other day, Donovan, about Tom Brady when he was being demonstrative toward his offensive coordinator on the sidelines. And Stephen A. said, what if Brady was a black quarterback? If he was an African-American quarterback, would the reaction be the same? Would he be allowed to, quote-unquote, get away with that kind of behavior? And it would just be called, intense. I didn't think that was the best example at the time. Stephen A. explained himself, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it in the future. Because I thought the better example there was actually Gronkowski and the reaction to Gronk. I do think race plays a part. Gronkowski has cultivated an image as a big, fun-loving guy. And as someone who's interacted with him a couple times, he was on Sports Nation, I've run into him and dealt with him a little bit. He is a big, fun-loving guy. Love Gronkowski. Who doesn't? So I'm not saying he doesn't deserve that. And I'm also not saying, by the way, that some African-American players can't also cultivate that image. I think of Charles Barkley, for example, in the NBA, right? I'm just saying it's more difficult for African-American players to cultivate that image. And it's far easier, and in an unknowable way, but in this way, I believe an obvious way, race does play a part. So, for example, if that was Martellus Bennett, who did the exact same thing as Gronk, let's keep the suspension aside for a second. What would the reaction have been? Would there have been outrage? Oh, my God, thuggish behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Never mind the fact that Martellus Bennett is kind of an intellectual, and Gronk is kind of the fun-loving caveman, right? But somehow it works for him in this context, and maybe that plays into something. His public persona plays into the fact that it's a 1-game suspension. Gronk should get minimum 2. You got to start at 2. I said originally at least a game, blah, blah, blah. You're right. It was the most egregious foul of the season. It should have been minimum of 2 games, and I believe that at least tangentially, at least in the sense that he never had to worry about being perceived as menacing or thuggish or anything like that, race plays a role here.